everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our instructional video on our introduction to genetics. Remember, guys, genetics is the science or study in how genes are going to be transmitted from one generation to the next. And remember, because all living things have DNA, we can see and track how genes might be transmitted in humans, even plants, and even other animals. Now, chromosomes, which are portions of DNA, we know are contained in the nucleus of all of our cells. Chromosomes are made up of DNA, and it's going to be a gene that we can find on specific chromosomes that represent segments of DNA that will control a hereditary trait. Now, what is a trait? Remember, a trait is a characteristic that an organism has, such as things like color, hair color, eye color, tall, short, skin color. But two alleles must be present in order for a trait to show up in an offspring. Remember, one must come from mom and the other one must come from dad. And when fertilization occurs between two sex cells that then forms new offspring, those two alleles combine to form that trait. Now, who discovered all of this? Well, a man named Gregor Mendel was actually an Austrian monk who was born in 1822. He performed several experiments on pea plants. And in his experiments, he discovered genetics. And so we call him the father of genetics. And while discovering all of these things, he created 3 laws that we abide by in terms of genetics. Now, those 3 laws, the first one is called the law of dominance and recessiveness. The second is the principle of segregation, and the last is the principle of independent assortment. Now, we'll talk about each and every one of these and what they mean in terms of genetics. But remember, it was his greatest contribution to demonstrate how those inherited characteristics are carried by genes and then passed along to offspring. Now, like I said previously, Mendel chose for his experiments the garden pea. Now, it was a good choice for a few different reasons. They were already readily available in the area in which he lived in. They were pretty easy to grow, and they grew quite rapidly, so he can perform many tests in a very small amount of time. And actually, the structures of the flowers of our pea plants also made it a little bit easier for him to either self-pollinate or cross-pollinate his plants. Now, Mendel knew that the pea plants were what's known as true breeding, meaning that they are allowed to self-pollinate. They would produce identical offspring to themselves. So, for example, right, if allowed to self-pollinate, tall plants would then always produce tall plants. Plants with yellow seeds would always produce offspring with yellow seeds. So these true breeding plants were actually the cornerstone of his experiment. So he manipulated the genes and DNA of these then plants to discover how they were inherited. Now, before we can move on, there's just a few more terms that we need to be familiar with. One being what's called the P generation or parental generation. Second is the F1 or first generation of offspring. The next is the F2 generation or second generation of offspring. And lastly is hybrid, right? This is the offspring of parents with different traits. Now, some of these terms Mendel used when he was setting up his experiments. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what he did. So Mendel crossed, we said, those true breeding tall plants, meaning they were always producing tall plants, with then true breeding dwarf plants. So he took that parent generation and he crossed them. The F1 or the first generation hybrids were all tall. All of the offspring had the appearance of then only one of the parents, and the trait of the other parent seemed to have disappeared. And so that got Mendel thinking that maybe the dwarf trait had been lost. But in conclusion, he discovered that there were certain types of factors that get passed along. Today, we know those factors to be genes. And each of the traits that Mendel observed in his pea plants were controlled by one gene. And it had then two contrasting forms. So the gene for the height of pea plants occurs in either a tall or a dwarf form. Those different forms of a gene are then known as alleles. So Mendel realized then that some alleles are dominant over the other. So that's in his first law that he discovered. It's known as the principle of dominance and recessiveness. So some alleles are dominant and others are recessive. A dominant allele can cover or mask a recessive allele. And so if the dominant allele is present in the offspring, the dominant trait will show up in the offspring. In a recessive allele, this trait will show up in the offspring only if the dominant allele is not present. All right, guys, that's it for our video. Please make sure that you jotted down notes as you watched the video, and please take a picture of your completed notes.